going to get started with our program on building paradise in Persian gardens. My name is Shelby Brown. I'm a senior education specialist here at the Villa, and it makes me very happy to welcome all of you here in the auditorium and all our viewers watching from near and far on Zoom. We are really delighted to host again a garden talk after a break. This talk complements the exhibition Persia, Ancient Iran and the Classical World, which is still on view through August 8th. Professor Touraj Daryaee holds the Massey Endowed Chair in Persian Studies and Culture at the University of California, Irvine, and he's also the director of the Dr. Samuel M. Jordan Center for Persian Studies and Culture. His research has focused on the ancient through early medieval history of Iran, specifically the Sasanian Empire, and not as a culturally separate part of the world, but in a context of a much broader history of communications and interconnections. He's also interested in Iranian languages and literature, numismatics, Zoroastrianism, ancient chess and backgammon, food, wine, and of course, gardens. Professor Daryaee has published many books, chapters, and articles in English and Persian, and has edited a vast array of books and journals, making it very difficult to summarize his accomplishments. Highlights include serving as the editor of the Oxford Handbook of Iranian History and the International Journal of Ancient Iranian Studies. And just to focus on very recent months, he has become the co-editor and a contributor to Food for Gods, Food for Mortals, Culinary and Dining Practices in the Greater Iranian World, which is the first volume of a new series this year through the UCI Center for Persian Studies. And he is co-editor of another new series this year, Sasanian Studies, Late Antique Iranian World, whose first volume just appeared. He also contributed, I would like to point out, to the beautiful catalog for the exhibition. So you can see that Professor Daryaee is constantly taking on new projects, and he doesn't just work on one thing at a time. Please welcome Professor Daryaee.
Thank you. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Shelby, for that kind introduction. I'm really glad to see some familiar faces. My friend Nasara Nakhavan, Ms. Alexa Sakaira from Getty itself, and Robert Rollinger, a colleague of mine and a friend. My talk will be, as mentioned, in conjunction and somewhat with the ancient Iran exhibition that is now here. And so if you get to see the catalog, it is the work of Sarah Cole, Jeffrey Spears, and Tim Potts who've worked together, and I'd like to thank them as well for putting out the book and the exhibition, in fact. So I'd like to bring some meaning to the function of gardens in ancient Persian or Iranian tradition. Rather than, if you came here to discuss the gardens itself and how a charbagh is different from a hasht behisht, the different types of gardening, you may be a bit disappointed. You'll get some of that. But rather, my point is something else. That is, what does the Persian garden mean as seen by the Persians within their imperial outlook? And you might say, as Emile Benveniste, a famous linguist a long time ago, stated, Iran or Persia is in fact, has been an empire in its makeup. He mentions 25 centuries. I would say in our century it comes to 26 centuries in some ways, where the king, who will be drinking wine in June, as mentioned, holds power, what is known in Old Persian as Kheshai, or what we call in modern Persian Shah, holds power over a certain area. And his title in Old Persian inscriptions is, of course, Kheshaytiyanam, king. We usually say king of kings, but in reality, he is a master or a power broker over other kings. So he's above other kings. And these other kings and principalities in Old Persian is called the dahyu, or countries. And these countries come together as a union and form this empire, as I say, this imperial outlook. And so you might see objects at the Getty today that come from Egypt, as distant as Egypt, or from Media and Persia, from the heartland of the empire, or from Anatolia. These are the dahyus of this great empire. And of course, if we're talking about empire, the king acts as a gardener, as a maintainer of this empire. And no one knows better about maintaining an empire or to study empire than my colleague Robert Rollinger, who has begun this project and trying to study antiquity through the prism of empires, which I think makes very much sense. So this is really what I am going to be talking about. That is, this empire which may be managed, should be taken care of, and it's done by the great king. So that is the preview of what I would be saying. And so garden becomes an ideological tool in some way. That is, you're seeing this beautiful garden, Bagh Jahan Nama in Shiraz, a beautifully walled garden, protected from the outside. Now here it's in the middle of a city in Shiraz. So you could see, of course, the sprawling city and suddenly a great green area on the side of it or in the midst of it. But in general, if you have a sense of the Iranian plateau's topography, it is a place that is relatively arid. And this arid landscape, the ancient Iranians till today have managed to create these spectacular gardens. Here's another garden, as you can see. I can't use this, but I'll use this. So you could see in the midst of this arid plain, suddenly you have this walled garden appear again, right? And this was devised through an ancient Persian invention called the qanat system, which, if you go to the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, you'll see its description. It's basically tapping the alluvial aquifers at the head of valleys and conducting the water along underground tunnels with gravity to bring it to a certain location, and in the middle of almost nothing, you get this. Of course, this needs management. This needs planning. And we're looking at this sort of a much more minuscule idea of gardening and managing. And when you think of the imperial outlook, we're looking on a much more obviously grander scale. I'm going to now whisk you away from a garden and throw you to the oldest strata of Iranian religious poetry, what are known as the Gathas, or the hymns of Zarathustra or Zoroaster, the prophet of the ancient Iranian religion. And I really like this passage of the Avesta, the sacred Zoroastrian hymns put together as a book later on, where Zarathustra states in this passage, and you can see him, of course, much later imagined in the European imagination, still as a savant, and so we may be who will make the world perfect or wonderful. O Mazda, this is the great super deity of the Zoroastrian tradition, and the Lord's harbinger of change by truth when our thoughts will have come together. Now, the term that is used here that is, I think, important in relation to our garden and empire by Zarathustra is frasha. Frasha is the term that means perfect, wonderful. So he's saying that at the end of time, may we be those who bring this heavenly perfection, this beauty, this wondrous sort of world. And this is the act of making something wonderful, beautiful, wondrous. So having that in mind as the background of perhaps this ancient Iranian sort of mental map of what they may be believing in, Then we can go to the Persian Achaemenid Empire, which lots of its objects obviously is on exhibition today. And you see that the Achaemenids, in fact, took on this term, Frasha, that exists in the Avesta of 1000 BC. I'm just giving you a relative date. There's much discussion on that. But several centuries later, this term Frasha is used to describe by the ancient Persians the gardens, the buildings, the parks that they put on this empire. So this place then becomes a place of perfection. It's a place that's perfect. So again, thinking of our walled gardens, right? A paradise obviously should be starting to come to your mind. And this, in Old Persian, the term paradaida, its median form paradiza, which enters into Greek, and of course in the translation of the Bible, when this heavenly place is sort of described, this term is used, this old Iranian term, to describe something that is beautiful, wondrous. But what is this paradiza? It's basically a Persian walled garden. Okay? It's a Persian garden. That is the term that is used. And for structures and places that is beautiful, perfect, and so on. So one of the capitals of this Achaemenid Persian Empire, and it was there were several capital. It was polycentric, if you want to use that terminology. Persepolis, Babylon, Susa, Ecbatana as sort of its heartland. We find that Darius, one of the great, I would say, builders or gardeners of the empire, states in his inscription, by the grace of Ahura Mazda, that is the great Lord, the Lord Wisdom, a great perfection, Frasha, we're using the same term again, was planned at Susa. Great perfection, Frasha, was made. And so now to make perfect, to make a perfection, is not this heavenly concept that Zarathustra has, but it has physicality. It has materiality. They're talking about now structures. And that is what this Persian Empire is attempting to project in its imperial outlook. Not that the ancient Persians were not fond of gardening. In fact, we read from various passages, and Xenophon has, I think, much to give us in terms of its description of the Persian king as a gardener, literally. So you might think of the Persian king in a paradisa himself doing gardening, as we see from this passage from Xenophon. Yet further continued Socrates, in all the districts he resides in and visits, he takes care of, I'm sorry, since I need my glasses, that's why I cannot read, although English is my second language. Okay. Visits, he takes care that there are paradises, as they call them, full of all the good and beautiful things that the soil will produce. And in this, he himself spends most of his time, except when the season precludes it. So we get a sense of here that the Persian king is interested in gardening in a sort of an interest. And Bruce Lincoln, an important scholar of history of religions at the University of Chicago, has given some very interesting thoughts in this regard. That the old Persian term for land, or the earth, you might say, is bumi, what you would get in modern Persian, boom, as in marzo, boom, which literally means land and boundaries. In fact, the Achaemenid Empire doesn't appear to have had a name, or we don't find it. And the suggestion is that the name for the empire, in fact, was this bumi, this land, and this land was seen as this paradise. And the campaign, the imperial project of the Achaemenid Persians was to, in fact, create paradise on earth. And their empire was indeed that paradise. And so this is a projection, again, ideological projection, right, of a garden and paradise. And if we take a look at Cyrus's palace in Pasargadae, one of the early capitals, we do get sense of actually gardening. And we already had the textual evidence, right? And this is a nice reconstruction of one of the palaces. And this garden, to be more exact, would have had a crisscross of actually water running through it. And this is the actually remains of Cyrus's palace and its garden. So you would have seen 1 and 2 going, and again, think of the qanat as bringing water in this arid region. And this brings to fore the idea of a Persian garden as a chahar bagh, or 4 gardens. That is the garden divided by paths or waterways into 4 symmetrical sections. And this we may see in Pasargadae first, as David Stronach, the late David Stronach, professor of archaeology at UC Berkeley, a really wonderful scholar, suggested that what we see here at Pasargadae becomes the typical sort of Persian garden, that it's going to be used and adopted not only in antiquity, but all the way into the later, if you want to use medieval or later times. So as far as India, you would get the tomb of Jahangir. Do you see the chahar, the 4 sections? That's what it means. Or you would go to Spain, to the Court of Lions in Alhambra, and you would see waters again running in the 4 streams and creating a 4 division. So that is what this chahar bagh, or the 4 section with water crisscrossing it, means. So in fact, there is some physicality of some Persian gardens that I'm talking about. But really, my talk is further about the ideological use of the garden. Now, I just don't want to dwell on the Achaemenid Persian Empire. I want to go a little bit further. So in late antiquity, 200 to 700 CE, we also find that walled gardens or hunting grounds still pervade and continue in the Sasanian Empire, something I know a little bit about. Here is a nice relief depicting the king in his royal hunt. And of course, you could see the water because there's music. And I want you again to think of a paradise, although there is some hunting going on. So to our modern sensibility, most probably that is not ideal thing to do today. But I want you to again imagine of a paradisa, a place that is lush and full of everything, as the Greeks described these Persian gardens, where there is music, and on the panel facing it, you'll see there's lots of music, and there's trees and lush, and of course, water. And so later on in Middle Persian, this term paradise also comes to be read as palis from paradisa, and also in Persian, as we use today, pardis. So these pardis, or pleasure gardens, you might say, continues in the Iranian world. And as you can see, it's actually walled off. It's blocked. So this is actually a controlled area. It's designed. It is just not, a scene of a place without any protection or care to it. In later, even medieval Persian manuscript tradition, of course, in the Timurid period, you get the sort of the apex of this artistic, I think, tradition in the Iranian world. You see that, although this is, of course, blocked by in a very different way, but the Persian garden and the idea of an enclosed space as a garden comes to fruition. By the late Sasanian period, this empire was called Iran-Shahr, the domain of the Iranians. And this domain was very much imagined as a garden. And the king in it, so we can imagine the king here giving a flower. And I want you to, again, remember this flower, gesture of flower giving. While there are different scenes being taken place, there's music, right? Flowers. There are ladies sitting actually in the garden on the carpet. It still has, I think, further meaning as such, is really imagined as the empire, where there's sweet smell, there's lush, there's water. Again, water is running everywhere. And this is the conceptual idea of a kingdom or of an empire. This empire in late antiquity, we get textual evidence from the preface to the Shahnameh, that is the Book of Kings of Abu Mansuri. This is the preface to the old Shahnameh before Ferdowsi composed his magnum opus, the Book of Kings, 1010, circa 1010 CE as the last date, where it is indeed given the boundaries of this empire of the Iranians as such. And the boundaries of Iran-Shahr, the land of the Iranians, is from Amu Darya, Oxus River, to Furat, Euphrates River. And these other regions are around it. And from these 7 regions, countries, or climes, Iran-Shahr is more magnanimous in every part. Obviously, the Chinese, when they were describing their kingdom, had grandiose ideas about theirs, as the Romans did, and so as the Iranians did. This is typical, of course, imperial views, but this is, of course, what the Iranians believed of their own empire. And so water on the side. But it's interesting that in late antiquity, this empire begins to get walled off. Unlike the Achaemenids, which we don't find these barriers, a very different imperial outlook, in late antiquity, we find barriers and walls being constructed. We have several walls that we know of, textual and archaeological evidence. And here is a segment of this wall, Divar Tarikhi Gorgan, or the Wall of Gorgan, sometimes known as the Barrier of Alexander, Sadd-i-Iskandar, in Turkish sometimes called Qizil Yalan, the Red Snake. And just below it, further down, there was another wall called the Wall of Tamish. And then to the west of the Caspian, we'll see there is a wall called the Darband Wall, Divar Darband, which is the Alan Gates. And in the south, dividing Arabian Peninsula and the Iranian plateau, there was a wall called what is later called Khandaq Shapur, the ditch, the moat of Shapur. And so, of course, as a historian, I'd like to visit, as we should, to get a sense of the territory and the land. And I can tell you that's me. A long time ago, I stuck myself with the late scholar Iraja Afshar, who was a great colleague and showed me many places to see. We walked on the wall of Gorgan. And it's quite clear when you're standing looking towards Iran-Shahr, you're seeing some greenery, lush, although you're in an oasis. But when you look towards the oasis, it is as if there is nothing. You get this sense of, as you're standing on the wall, that you are in fact feeling, and I'm saying this not in a derogatory way, civilization and the outer reaches of civilization. Civilization meaning that there's some, as a city, or there's some sort of culture, and then outside. Certainly nomads have their own cultural world, and that's as important. But ideologically speaking, if you were there in the 3rd century, the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century, certainly, and from the 6th and 5th, looking over this wall, there seems to be a divide from the inner and the outer. And we have ample information about these walls. Yaqut, in his Mu'jam al-Buldan, states, it was Kisra Anushiravan, that is the Sasanian king Khosrow Anushiravan, Khosrow I, ruler in the 6th century of Common Era, who built it as an obstacle against the Turks and their raids to Tabaristan. So this is at the time that the Turkic nomads are coming from Inner Asia into the Near East. They have not settled to create these great polities that they do in time. Obviously, the Turkic empires and Turkic kingdoms, of course, the most famous is the Ottoman Empire, later on as a consequence of this movement. But in the 5th, 6th century, they're being impeded somewhat because of this great wall, because the people inside think of the nomadic people very differently. And so they built the wall. And this wall was just not a simple wall being put up. Eberhard Sauer, an important scholar and archaeologist, and Jebriel Nokande, who's now the director of the National Museum of Iran, have put out a wonderful book and several studies, and more books are coming, of the immense importance of this wall and the effort that was put to create this wall. It's a wall that goes from the Caspian Sea, which you can just see the side of it, all the way to the mountains to the east. It's 195 kilometers long. And along this 195 kilometers, there are actually fortifications. And the number is 33 that's been found so far. In fact, this is the longest ancient wall built in antiquity. It's the longest ancient continuous wall in antiquity, which we rarely hear about, right? But to build such a wall, to upkeep it, to keep soldiers, and of course it has gates, because you don't just build walls to keep everybody out. You actually are managing trade. You're managing things from inside and outside, was a monumental task. That's what I mean to have a garden as an empire and try to manage it, the amount of money and effort that goes into it. Now, if we move with this wall to the west of the Caspian, throughout time, in the medieval times, it's been kept up. And we have a much better sense of how this wall would have looked. So look at the wall of Derbent, right, in the western side. And this is what I think I want you to imagine, which is very hard to do so when you're here, right? Yeah, you're standing on some bricks, you get a sense. But if you were really standing on all the bricks standing, I think this is what you would have been seeing, something similar to it, the wall of Derbent. And this wall of Derbent, as you can see, has gates. And so for gates is to gauge traffic of who comes in, what commodities come in. Obviously, empires, they were in trade with nomadic peoples and tribes. They needed commodities on both sides. And in fact, there was always contact. And we know that there was intense Sasanian observation and upkeep of these walls. This one has 7 gates and 27 towers, and it's as high as 170 to 200 meters. And that was, again, built to manage the coming of nomadic tribes from the Caucasus in the north. And again, of course, it's quite green here, not that it's not green there, but I think it's a different view. So we find along this wall now a great Dagestani scholar has studied the wall and all the Middle Persian inscriptions that have actually been put into this wall from late antiquity by the Sasanians. And we know that they were keen on, because they sent the accountant of their northwestern province of Azerbaijan, what is in Middle Persian is known as Adur Badagan, which may go back to Aturpatn, the satrap of the Achaemenid Empire, although now there appears to be other suggestions, I've been told, that we find they've put these inscriptions into the walls, that the accountant came and made surveys and made sure. And this is done by Dr. Gajiev Mortazali, who is in Dagestan and has now, I'm hoping to see the book of all these inscriptions in Middle Persian, that the Amargar, and we see the title of Amargar everywhere on these reliefs or these stones, that were managing this important wall. Within the wall, I want to go back to our Timurid imagery. And what's in a garden? What does a garden mean? And that is, of course, what I've been trying to say. So a place of beauty, right? Where you sit, there is water, and a place of perfection. I can think of, again, Xenophon. And we saw images of, within the garden, actually people putting on carpets, as people still do in Iran sometimes in the parks. The carpet itself, I would suggest, is in itself a walled garden. And when you look at most of the imagery of carpets, Persian carpets being made, in fact, it's a scene of garden. Now, there are variety region to region, but mostly you find this place that it's lots of flowers, trees, birds, and it's a garden. So again, that idea of a garden as a beautiful place can be now transported as a carpet. And you could go sit in a garden wherever you are. And sometimes we may have it in our house. It's the garden within our house. And The empire is in fact imagined as if you would be sitting, I think, on the carpet. Now, who dwells and what dwells inside and outside of the garden is managed, obviously, by the gardener, i.e., the King of Kings, if you are ruling the Sasanian or the Achaemenid Empire. And for this imagery of, again, of a king's garden and sort of the netherworld garden, and this garden in late antiquity, we have lots of, again, textual evidence and imagery. I just picked one that I've particularly liked. If you know about the Manichaeans, this is a Gnostic religion that takes hold in the 3rd century in the Sasanian province of Mesopotamia, where Mani, who is here imagined here in a fragment that survives from a wall in the east, proclaims to be the seal of the prophets, who brings perfection and the end of all prophethood from Jesus, Zoroaster, Buddha, and others, and he is the seal of the prophets. He is in the Sasanian Empire, and we have a fragment where, in fact, he is in discussion with Mehr Shah, king of Mishan, southwestern Iran, who is the brother of the great king, the king of kings, Shapur I, the Sasanian king, where the discussion goes as such, as the text tells us. In the paradise, this is Mehr Shah telling Mani. And the seal of Mani, by the way, I would suggest that you go to the exhibit and see. It's a crystal white seal that was discovered by Susanna Gulashki, was written an article on this, and definitely go see the seal of prophets, where the text says, in the paradise of which you speak, is there a garden such as mine? So the Persian local king, right, the brother of king, is saying, look at my garden. Is it as beautiful? This, again, harkens back to Xenophon's reference to a Persian gardening and the kings being interested in the garden. And Mani, of course, states, is as mine, showed him and then Mani, it's in fragment, Mani showed him the paradise of light, a garden with all kinds of things and other desirable sights there. So Mani shows this sort of the heavenly, right, garden. But again, its description goes back to the idea of a paradisa, an old Persian garden, a paradaida. And inside this walled garden is what I call a paradisical state of paradise. And this idea of a state of paradise is again found in the old Iranian religious tradition of a primordial who becomes a king, an important personage. His name in the Avesta is called Yima in the Persian Book of Kings, and later is known as Jamshid, who has created in the Zoroastrian tradition a place called a Vara, and we'll talk about it in the next image, where inside this beautiful place, here's the Avesta, and what we're talking about in the second book of the Videvdad or the Vendidad, a section of the Avesta, the story of Yima comes about, Jamshid, where there's a primordial paradise, and he is the builder of this paradise. And what he built in the Avesta, it's called a Vara. A Vara, which basically is cognate, I think, with the English wall. It means basically a wall or an enclosure, okay? And so Ahura Mazda, the Zoroastrian super deity, has told Yima to build this wala and place in it everything that is good in it, a pair of everything that is good. It sounds similar to our biblical tradition of Noah, exactly. And of course, hence I could not find a picture of Yima's or Jamshid's Vara, but I think a Persian miniature of the story of Noah's Ark, I thought, would do just as fine, where pairs of good animals and all that is good is put onto the ship. Just think in the Iranian sense would actually be a wall, and some saw it as an enclosure, capsized, where everything is put in there before the great winter comes to destroy everything. Okay, so this idea of the king, or not the king, but Yima creating a paradise, something that everything nice is in it, is then taken as a paradigm of an empire, where everything is good in it. Of course, the idea of king as a gardener is somewhat, I hope, clear to you. But in paradise, I think there's also a dark side to it. And that has to do with the idea of the king acting as a gardener. The gardener doesn't only sort of garden inside this wall, but also, of course, takes the weeds and things that are unwanted within this empire. This is called the theory of gardening state, where we have actually literal evidence. In the 6th century, Khosrow Anushiravan, the person who built these walls, our text was telling us, the great wall that I was standing on, right, and the wall of Darband that you saw. It is at this time that there is a movement called the Mazdakite Revolt. In fact, I just wrote an article that should be out in the Cambridge History of Socialism, and this is sort of the first chapter. So it's like a proto-socialist prophet, reformer, a Zoroastrian priest, who its opponents, or his opponents, state that he said that property, land, and women should be shared. There shouldn't be private ownership. So you can imagine this creates all sorts of chaos within an empire. And so Khosrow, this king, comes and has to restore order, and if you can imagine, to the garden, right? And in fact, in the great Book of Kings, Shahnameh by Ferdowsi, we read, and Kasra is Khosrow, in fact. Khosrow or Kisra has this finale and this action done to the Mazdakites and brings Mazdak to the garden. He says, come here, I'm going to show you something. In Kasra's palace, there was a garden with a high wall around it. It was dug up from end to end, and Mazdak followers were planted there head down with their feet in the air like trees. And the story goes that Khosrow says, see what you have planted. Again, this idea of use of gardening and trying to weed out the unwanted, right? If you're thinking of it as a political idea, is really available in this tradition of the king acting literally as a gardener, but sometimes figuratively as a gardener. So this is to maintain the inside of the garden. And it said something already about outside of the garden, right? Description of the outside of the garden in Middle Persian text usually describes the nomadic tribes that were coming onto the scene from the 3rd, really 4th century CE onwards. The Huns, the Bedouins from the south, Heftalites and Turks, which are described in really monstrous ways in this Middle Persian literature, Zoroastrian literature. Even the verb used for their coming is not for them to come, but rather rush, davaristan. Demonic terminology is even described in terms of the movement of these people. And so in late antiquity, the idea is that this wall is a barrier against what in Middle Persian they call Ir, meaning Iranians, and Anir, non-Iranians. There's a clear dichotomy and division here, where outside, where there's Anir, there is disorder, injustice, and it's barren, as we saw in the picture. And outside of it, it's a devilish space in a certain sense. So you want to be where? Inside. You want to be inside the garden, right? And so as Yima has built the Vara, the wall, here we see Khosrow again appearing in this sort of beautiful, it's called Cup of Solomon or Cup of Khosrow, which is in France today. He's sitting there. He acts in a way, I would suggest, like Yima or Jamshid. He is a paradise builder. He's building the wall, right? He's built this paradise and is keeping good things inside and keeping death, cold, chaos, disorder outside. To conclude, basically, is this idea of inside-outside, good and bad, is very much obviously quite well known, but it goes to the root of this Persian conception of the world, in the Zoroastrian sense, you might say. In the Zoroastrian tradition, there is a strong element of dualism in place, where the opposition, you may know, of good and evil, not gods, because Ahura Mazda is the super deity, its opponent is the evil spirit, is not a god. I want you to know. In time, some of this changes, but in reality, there is a dualism where the good and evil is quite separated. And even their space is separated. So what's inside? You saw flowers? Remember smelling flowers? It's green, it's lush. And in fact, there is such detailed description of flowers and smells and its association with people in late antiquity in the Iranian world that is staggering. We go back to the flower that I told you we saw in that medieval manuscript. Here is a Sasanian manuscript. A king, perhaps Bahram II, is giving a flower to his lady, Shapur Dokhtag. But the world is also divided in smells. And that's something that I've given a lecture before. Not to bore you, I'm going to finish this very quickly, but I want you to know that the inner world, the inside the wall, it's the world of boy aromatics, fresh scent. And that's why flowers, I would contend, that is there everywhere. And we find descriptions of Persians over-perfuming themselves, over-flowering themselves, having, as we have when Alexander gets to the court of Darius III, finds so many garland and perfume makers. It should make sense in some way. And it's this idea that in the ideal, beautiful world of your empire, it should be sweet-smelling. And its opposition is outside, where there's gandagi, stench, where it's the realm of the evil spirit. And a world without smell does not exist. It's either this or that, because there is this dualistic view. Just quickly to go, and these are some of the images that I've just included, you can find that the scent of every flower is associated with someone. The scent of the yellow jasmine is just like the scent of a noble woman who is not a courtesan. So courtesans were probably putting on some jasmine perfume and creating some issues we can get. But as you can see, the scent of mothers, the scent of girls, and these are the translations most recently by the work of Samra Zarnush. But you can just go through. There's so many. I've just picked examples. The scent of a bride, the scent of an old woman. And then the smell of flowers, and flowers that we don't sometimes recognize again. But flowers are everywhere. Scent of religious authorities, rulers of countries, scent of nobilities. And so it's this inside, outside. And the inside is the garden that the kings managed. To conclude, and I'd like to actually dedicate this talk, if I can, since I don't know if my mom is watching or not. This is a picture of that you saw at the beginning of the Fien garden in Kashan. My mom, I just talked to her yesterday. She was in Kashan. She has a little garden there, and I talked to her. I said, I'm coming up for this talk. And in fact, these gardens are, I think they go far beyond a mundane idea of gardening. And I would close by this passage from the Shahnameh, where the late Sasanian king in the 7th century gives a, I think, very important prediction and also idea of what people should be doing and the king. So the king says, and I think it's Khosrow II, Iran is like a lush spring garden, where roses ever bloom. The army and weapons are the garden's walls, and lances its walls of thrones. If the garden's wall, divar, vara, do you remember? Nima's vara, are pulled down, then there would be no difference between it and the wilderness beyond. Take care not to destroy its walls, and not to dishearten or weaken Iranians. If you do, then raiding and pillaging will follow. And also the battle cries of raiders and the din of war. Risk not the safety of the Iranian wives, children, and lands by bad policies and plans. Thank you. So I think please.
Touraj, we have some online questions as people slowly make their way to the mics to ask questions here. One of the questions is, are Persian gardens mapped out in accordance with the 4 cardinal directions? And is there any astrological symbolism and orientation?
Okay, so I'm pretty much ignorant in that phase. But what I came to see, every time I was trying to actually take a map of a garden, the gardens actually are geometrical. I didn't actually find any round gardens. In fact, they're square, or they're based on some sort of a cardinal point. I think the gardens that we saw in the arid spaces, of course, was from the direction where the qanats are actually pulled, where the water is able to be brought from the high point to the low point, and in that direction that water can run. But that's as far as I would know.
And another question is whether you could, maybe this will just be a series of questions that focus on the plants when you were focusing on ideology, but could you explain a bit more about the image of the king giving the flower?
Sure. So I think already at Persepolis, in the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, you see Medes and Persians, they're strolling around and going up perhaps to the court. They're all holding flowers. A series, I think there's a panel. Everybody's holding flowers. You find in the Sasanian period, as we saw, flowers being given to a lady, or flowers are here and there. I think this goes back, at least to my mind, this conception of the beautiful world, the paradisical world, is a place that sweet smells, and mainly it's flowers, right, that are important, are being smelled. And so it's not only a gesture of beauty to give the lady a flower, and we do have a description of actually Spandar Marzagan. It's a specific time in the calendar in antiquity in Iran where Biruni tells us that it was a time that flowers were given to ladies. It's almost close to Valentine's, actually, in its time period, which is really fascinating, that they gave flowers, as Biruni mentions. But I think it goes back to this idea of the beautiful realm, the place that has sweet smells is the place of beauty.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I know in a lot of the textbooks, Mazdak gets mentioned and a lot of cool things involving revolts. But when Islamic culture came in, or when the Ilkhanate came in with Buddhist culture as well, how did that get integrated into the gardens or viewed in the same dialectic process or whatever process to integrate it?
Sure. How Mazdak or the garden?
How did the garden incorporate revolts or other people taking over Iran?
So, I mean, I think the idea of the king as a gardener and the gardening state goes beyond the Iranian world. It's just a theory, that it's a political theory that's thrown, that the king has to manage order. And he sees this place, in fact, as a garden. And anytime and anywhere there is revolt, the king, of course, comes down hard. And it's the idea of the gardening state, to pull out and sort of to destroy this, what is unwanted. I think the best evidence for Iran that I can find, and there are revolts in other places, is the Mazdakite Revolt. And not only that, but in the illustrated manuscript, they're actually being implanted backwards. So it's really giving us this sense of a gardening state very well, of a person who has brought chaos. But I think I see less of that in the later periods, where gardens are there, right? But we don't see this really sort of direct, I think, association. Nasser and John.
Hi. You know, the history of garden, wall garden, we know from the Achaemenid, at least I know from Achaemenid onward. Is there any record of pre-history? How did it start and where we can?
I think even more famous, one should go to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon.
No, in Persia. No,
Oh.
in Babylon. In Egypt and Persia, Babylon we know. Here, Persia.
Yeah, but I think, you know, I don't know that much, but I know it's the Mesopotamians who are the forerunners of these gardening. Mm-hmm. And much of these things, the Syria exhibit is still there, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think much of this is a model that's taken from the Assyrian world. I think the Assyrians created the first museums. I think Professor Rollinger could tell us sort of this horticultural sort of interest of the king and gardens is really, at least for the Persians, I think when they come onto the plateau, because they're just our more recent arrivals, right? We have these autochthonous civilizations on the plateau, but doesn't give us this type of, I think, garden. I don't see any. And I would suggest and think that it's still borrowing from this Mesopotamian world onto the Iranian plateau.
So that was the influence or impact of
I think
the
Mesopotamia.
Mesopotamia
Absolutely, I think
to
so.
Persian Empire.
Yes.
So there is no record before that.
That I don't know. We can ask
Elamite,
Professor.
the-
I don't know of the Elamite garden. I'm sure there must have been gardens, but not, I think, in the way that the king likes to do garden. But the Greeks, of course, most observed the Persians. But before that, of course, the Assyrians were doing it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not quite sure how to phrase my question, but it's related to the idea of gardens and nature, and the power of the king as gardener is sort of seems to be like the garden is kind of an extrapolated nature in a way. What is is the king then almost sort of like the biblical Christian biblical king, God rather, in control of nature? How does he where does his power stop with regard to that, and where does it start?
Sure. So I think, thank you for this question. I think the king, if he's a good Zoroastrian king, we should remember the king has to create some sort of order on earth as the great Zoroastrian God has created order, right? He has created order in the cosmos and the universe. The king, as a representative of the king, creates that order on earth. And this garden, which should have only plants that are beautiful, great, and sort of paradisical, you might say, is in charge of that. But obviously there is always harm that can come to it. And this is this dualistic nature, where the world of chaos and evil can always bring harm, even to the plants. So we have actually lists of heavenly plants, and where actually the evil spirit attacks it by, for example, thorns is sometimes described in these Zoroastrian texts as actually or sometimes the protection, but the evil spirit actually brings harm to these plants to kill it, or they're actually just plants that bring harm that should be actually whisked away. So there's still a great duality of even of the nature of plants and what they are. But no sweet-smelling plant that I know is part of the evil spirit. It's everything that is fragrant or has buoy is in fact part of the heavenly realm.
Thank you very much.
We have a question from someone who lived in Iran in the early 70s and noticed the gardens everywhere, whether in a village or city. And the question relates to whether the large imperial gardens in the past also inspired Persians from small villages to similarly create walled gardens. Do we know?
I think it's both an inspiration, where you know that the king has this great garden. But I think, as someone who at some point in my life for a decade or more had time to traverse the Iranian plateau, so just not major cities of Iran has, Tehran, Shiraz, Esfahan, Mashhad, and, Tabriz as great cities. But if you travel within the plateau, you get the sense that it's not the seas that so much like we're looking at the Pacific Ocean, it's the arid landscape. And I think the carpet, in fact, is a response to that aridity. That is, you want something full of flowers and beautiful to sit in, right? And I think to create a garden, even a small garden, is in fact to create that heavenly place, that beautiful place within this very arid place. It takes a lot of work. Water has always been an issue in the Iranian plateau and its management. So everyone to their own power and ability have created a garden to create that space of beauty.
Did Persian ideas of gardens travel east as well as west to India, Tibet?
I think so. I showed a picture of Lahore, right? And so at least for the Char Bagh, David Stronach and others have suggested that in fact these Persian gardens make their way. I don't know if the Hasht Behesh, the 8 gardens, but that has much more of a Islamic sort of Quranic idea. But the Charbagh obviously made it all the way to Spain. And if you go, of course, Getty is the best of the museums that I know, but if you go to Smithsonian and just walk out of Sackler on the side, you'll see that they've recreated the Charbagh just for people to see. So it's made it to Washington, D.C. from Pasargade.
Could you comment on whether the empire projects itself as the owner of the garden or the steward of the garden?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the king is the caretaker of this empire. It has to make sure that there is order, and by order, so in the Iranian world, the idea of order also means truth. Okay, and lie and chaos actually are synonymous in some ways. The king is the maintainer of this garden, as he's been given the power to do so from Ahura Mazda. And so he has to maintain this beauty and order.
I want to make sure I'm not stopping anybody from coming up and asking questions. So
Yes, there's a question back there. But her hand is, yes, your hand is actually injured, so I don't know if you want to walk down here. I don't know. But she has a question. Maybe I could hear. I don't know.
you could call it out.
Call it out, please. Yes, please. Yeah. My sense was just since the water courseway has divided the garden or the place into 4 sections, that is simply what we call Charbagh. Now, I don't know of its numerology or significance as such, but at least the suggestion is it's very old as 6th century BC when Cyrus was doing his palace. And like to have a garden that actually has water right crisscross it, and hence a 4 garden. But I don't know actually beyond that. It may. Although Charbagh is easier than Sabah. Yes, but you're right. You're right. Yes. Mesopotamian again. What is it, Robert? Shar Kibratim Arba'im. Right? The 4 king corner of the world.
There's a very specific question about the meaning of the red snake for the barrier and whether it might relate to the dragon slaying myth.
I think this is later, Turkic tradition. When the Turkic tribes come and they do settle there, right? If you go there, you'll see that, of course, the Turkmen Sahra is right next to it. And the population is, of course, quite mixed. I think I don't know why they mentioned it, but having seen the wall, it may have had red paint. I don't know, but they called it Qizil Yelan, red snake, for reasons that are out of actually, I do not know. Okay?
There's also a question about the tree of life in Persian legends and whether there's a concept of forbidden fruit.
Forbidden fruit. Yeah. So in the Zoroastrian classification of fruits and so on, it's divided, and there are fruits, and this is really, I think, is inspired by the Hellenistic tradition. Fruits you could have seeds inside, skins outside, but if a fruit to be forbidden, I cannot think of. Right now, I cannot actually remember of a forbidden fruit, as there is in the biblical tradition. And then that would give you knowledge. Yes?
Hello, what is this, the Khosrow flower?
Nobody knows. There are a number of flowers mentioned. There's an Ardashir flower. There's a Khosrow flower, which you must try to trace this in, for example, Persian literature, right? And hasn't been found. I mean, someone should perhaps try to do so. One day when we have like a Thesaurus Lingua Graeca, all the Persian texts are put into a computer, you could do a search, right? And then you may be able to find it. But as far as I know, there's no identification of these flowers anymore.
So
What was the original name of the rose, the Persian rose as we know it now? Obviously, it was not Mohammadi flower.
Gul Mohammadi.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would point you to Ibrahim Purdavut, who has actually a really interesting book on flowers of not only roses, which seems to actually be connected to this Iranian world, but also tulip, which we usually, of course, associate with Netherlands and Turkey, right? The symbol, but seems to have actually come from the East. And I don't, I haven't really looked on the number of terms and devices, but I know there are a number of these flowers that comes from the East and also the Iranian world and make it to the West. So I am not really privy to that information. Yes, the microphone is coming.
I'm curious as to access into the gardens. Do you have any idea as far as particularly with the early gardens, the ancient gardens, who had access to be able to get inside the garden?
Oh, yeah. I think the king's gardens is the king's garden. And those who are allowed by the king or to come and see this place of beauty. Obviously, others were able to see it to then describe it back, right? That or hearsay that the Persian king likes gardening, right? As Xenophon and others mentioned. But it's so beautiful. You could find everything that you could imagine. And sometimes there's a laundry list of the trees, of the flowers, and the water. So others were privy, but I think this is the prerogative of the king and the court that would allow people to come in. But it wasn't, I think, an open space, and that's why it's walled. It's enclosed.
In the 20th century, that would have been, I guess, the Shah's gardens. What was the access like for the public? Do we know?
I did not have access to the imperial gardens, right? Because those who then were privy and close to the king or for ceremonies probably saw the gardens. Of course, after the revolution, many of these palaces are open. So you could now walk into the gardens and see, and there's still gardeners who are taking care of the gardeners and the grass that is lush. So it's being still upkept, so you could get a sense of this garden. Can I tell you, for the 20th century, I didn't see something that would be really quite spectacular in the royal gardens. In fact, it's these more public gardens that I showed you, but they're still walled off, right? Because they need to be protected. It's just not a running garden like a British sort of area which has lots of water but still needs maintenance. It's these gardens that are actually open to the public that is really interesting.
Touraj, I'm going to ask two more related sort of questions from Zoom, then we'll see if anybody has any more questions as we wind down.
Yes.
I'm combining two questions that relate to farming and medicinal plants. Do gardens take any kind of farming into consideration, or how do they relate? And do medicinal plants grow in these gardens? Do you know?
So I think it's pretty clear from antiquity that, for example, in the West, there are three types of medicinal sort of remedies. There is one by prayer, one by knife, and the other one is by plants. So obviously, they knew of the medicinal nature of these plants and how they work. I was actually interested for a while in plants and sort of not only its classification, but what it does. Because if you go to any Persian bazaar, to an attari, there's this guy who actually sells, plants, dry plants and so on. But you could ask him for various ailments and he'll tell you what you could actually use. So this is an older, I think much more oral tradition, although we do have texts, right, of medicinal plants and its uses. Obviously, it's an old one, but I knew of people who I should have contacted who were experts in this, and they knew each plant what their importance was. But still, today in Bazaar, you are getting this, oral tradition, life tradition of what each of these plants are good for. It's dried, how to be used, how to be rubbed, how to be drank, or whatnot, which I still do as well. As in Iranian, we still, for stomachache, I don't take usually Pepto-Bismol or anything. I usually use gulab, rose water, with some saffron crystal rocks, that gives me the remedy. I try not to go into the modern medicine if I can help it, but again, some of it works and some of it is, of course, more fantastic.
And meanwhile, ordinary farming just for food is a separate entity outside the special garden?
I think so. That's I think, a completely different issue.
Are there any more questions from our audience?
Hi there. First of all, great talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So thank you for that. But you kind of touched on this this duality a little bit, and I'm wondering if there was a causal duality related to the evil and good. So I walk into, let's say, a Persian house or something, and they have a lot of plants, but if all the plants are dying, I think, wow, these people are not so great. They're evil or something. Or is it reverse? Also, like you were talking about, even at cologne and perfume they put on, all the other things that kind of demonstrate some level of what the old paradise might be like. Does it still exist? There's like this causal duality also in the physicality? And if it is the case, do you think it's been further removed from, has the causal been reversed? So I look more to the outside to judge the inside versus saying maybe it'll come back up or it'll reverse such that actually the goodness is still there, but maybe there's like a dark period happening or something.
Yeah, I think the lack of maintenance of a garden, that means that you have a bad gardener, bad king, right? Someone who, that's also used very well, and which will create chaos and disorder. But, ideologically, that means the king is inept and should be removed. But, as a post-Sasanian, that is in the Islamic period when Islam takes hold, I think some of these ideological tendencies lose their ground. But some of it is adopted, and smells also change. It's interesting that, for example, gulab, rosewater, something that is really central to sort of this Iranian world. And it's used for religious ceremonies, Shiite religious ceremonies, for example, among others, seems to be lacking in large part in the pre-Islamic tradition, in use of specific places. So still, the smell prevails, but it's different smells. Right? In antiquity, it's kondor. It's, incense. And there are flowers. Jasmine is pervasive. While we see in the Islamic tradition, then you get these other smells, but still, it's full of smell. But the idea of each place should have its own smell, and even invoke that smell, is very much part of in different places, different cultures have that, where you smell something and you will be transported or give you a sense of a feeling or a place. Yes?
Was there any influence from Buddhists and other cultures, from the Mongols or from the Turks, that affected the technology used in gardens at different periods?
Oh, wow. I don't, okay. The answer is I do not know, because I'm not in the know about the technology. But I think Iran has an open plateau which has seen the immigration of people, for thousands of years. The Iranian speakers themselves are, of course, immigrants, right? Everybody is, the world has been moving. People have been moving. It reminds me of Robert's book. How many thousand, what was it, the title of the book? 300,000. People have been moving everywhere continuously. So this idea that everybody is, of course, doesn't work. But as successive people have come, they've brought new ideas. And of course, the good things are obviously adopted and co-opted. And good ideas that were within this landmass was also adopted and co-opted by others. I think there's a continuous borrowing, right, of new ideas and new things when it's good.
There's one more online question that we do have to end with, because it relates to wine, and where wine grapes and vineyards fit into such gardens.
Oh, that's a good one. You have to come or listen in June 11th and 12th. But, I think I give you an example. I was going to close to Mashhad, where you're from, Daryaee. So this is on the border of Iran and Turkmenistan. Going up on the mountain, there's this fabulous Sasanian complex found. What we call a Dastgard, what I call it. It's a princely or a sort of a chateau of one of these nobilities, right? And you'll find this in certain places. And I'm looking through, and this older scholar of an archaeology next to the chateau had seen this really strange structure that was high, and there was like an elevation that it could also roll down. So the idea was by the archaeologists that this was, of course, a place for Zoroastrians. When they pass away, they put their bodies there and the blood sort of goes down and not. Obviously, that doesn't work. I looked around. There's Turkestan. There's so many vineyards around. I said, may I suggest, with all due respect, that they were actually making wine here. And it's a winery and doesn't need to be so complex and it's sort of religious. So they looked at me, maybe. I said, you could see all this sort of grapes grown. And you see actually, of course, the amount of wine that is allotted. In fact, May, or what's in Old Iranian is madhu or mud, is of course part of rations of foods as well. So it's sort of production, and then by late antiquity, what kind of May? Clarified, unclarified, and red, white, mixed. All of this becomes so nuanced in late antiquity. Obviously, there is some sort of control, and there are kingly, of course, wine that may be very different from the popular wines. Thank you.
So everyone, please join me and join the Getty in thanking Professor Daryaee for this really fabulous talk.
Thank you. I'm going to leave this here.
Thank you.